resistance to that idea. Okay, there we go. Well, good morning, good afternoon or evening, and welcome to a gathering of people across time zones. My name is Betsy Greber, and I'll be moderating this conversation about government communication. Just a reminder that we are recording this session and that it will be posted and used for educational purposes. I want to start this by just giving a bit of background on why we are here today having this conversation. It's all because of a partnership between Indiana University and the Andriy Milesevich Kiev-Mohyla School of Governance at the National University of Kiev-Mohyla Academy. And this partnership was funded by the US Department of State in 2018, when we signed a partnership agreement. Actually, we did that in 2019 in the spring, when the Indiana University group visited in Kiev. We lost the former president of the National University of Kiev-Mohyla Academy, Andriy Milesevich, who was a key figure in this partnership. He passed away earlier this year. And so we are deeply grateful that the School of Governance is named after him. So despite COVID, the faculty of the Milesevich School has done a remarkable job of launching a master's degree in government communication and also an in-service or in-training program for government communication workers. They're also working on undergraduate programs in this area. Which brings me then to today's session, where we hope to reflect a bit on the philosophical underpinnings of training future generations of government workers and the role of government communication in a complicated global media landscape. Our panel is diverse in terms of geography and expertise. It spans from educators to people who are working in the trenches as government communicators. We'll start the conversation with the panelists. Some will have to leave a little early, and then we'll also take questions from the audience. So instead of me introducing the panelists, I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves briefly and tell us how they are related to government communication. And I'm going to start here with Vivian Walker. Vivian, would you please start that process? Vivian?
Yeah, got it. So do you want me to just introduce myself or launch into the remarks as well? Or you want to go around?
Let's just introduce the whole panel. So if you could introduce yourself and just help us understand your angle on government communication. Thank you.
Sure. I'm currently the executive director of the U.S. Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy, which is an independent federal advisory commission that assesses the Department of State's public diplomacy activities, to include the ones contained within the department, as well as those associated with the U.S. Agency for Global Media. I began originally as a diplomat, a foreign service officer, working as a public diplomacy officer in a number of countries. I did that for about a quarter of a century. And then I moved over into the realm of teaching. And began as a professor of national security strategy at the National War College in Washington, D.C. And I've also taught public diplomacy and strategic communication at Central European University in Budapest, at the Center on Public Diplomacy at the University of Southern California, and then most recently at Georgetown University in the School of Foreign Service. So my approach to these issues is based both on a fair amount of practical experience, as well as someone who now teaches and assesses the practice. And I came to this sort of kind of a backdoor. So I apologize. I really know very little about the program. I'm not really even sure who the audience is, apart from the folks who are here. I have just finished a pretty intensive program in Kyiv, working with the Diplomatic Academy on embedding public diplomacy training into the curriculum. So that explains why I'm here.
Thank you, Vivian. Chuck, can we move to you next?
Sure thing. So my name is Chuck Carney. I'm Director of Media Relations for Indiana University, covering all of our campuses throughout the state of Indiana. And I've been in this role since November of 2017. I've been at IU since 1999, where Betsy was one of the first people I worked with when I came here from the University of Florida. So I've been in academics, the academic side of it for a while, but not strictly in public relations and communications. I came here as the director of our public broadcasting television station, news director, and throughout that time, I have also taught in the journalism and now media school, either journalism or public relations. I teach public relations students right now. Between my news and journalism role that brought me here, I became a communications and marketing director for 2 schools that are within Indiana University. And going back before that, I was a journalist for about 20 years, started when I was in high school, actually working in journalism and broadcasting. And so I came at this after being a journalist for a long while, which has really informed a lot of what I do. My job is to communicate with the public and speak on behalf of the university on all sorts of matters, some of which I want to speak about and some of which I'm not so wild about speaking out about, but that's the job. And so I'll be happy to get into that and happy to be here to talk to you all today.
Thank you, Chuck. Agnese, can we go to you next?
Yeah, thank you. I must say good evening, everybody, because in Latvia, where I am currently located, it's 6 p.m. But for several of you, I assume it's morning or early day. So I am very glad and thrilled and excited to be part of this panel and speak about strategic communication. A little bit about myself. I used to be a very passionate and devoted news journalist in Latvia for more than 10 years. And then 14 years ago, I converted to, 14 years ago, I converted to media and communication scholar. And probably the main reason why I'm here today is because we started cooperation with Mahila Academy several years ago, and we had very successful cooperation project running where we were exchanging our students and doing also teacher mobilities. So we learned about this new program that they were developing, and I can say that we are very excited to see what is the result out of it. Besides that, I am the leader of a group of teachers at my university, which is Vidzeme University of Applied Sciences, which is a micro university basically located outside of the capital of Latvia, Riga, very close to Estonian border, if it makes any sense to mention this here. Yeah, we were a group of lecturers who developed a study program in strategic communication and governance. And actually, this academic year is the first year where we fully implement the program the way we wanted it to be when we started. So I do not want to pretend to be like the most expert in strategic communication among my colleagues. However, I was taking this lead role in establishing this study program and hence yeah, probably I'm in position to say something also about strategic communications. Now, after all this done, we have the work that we have done. So that's about me. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Next, I'd like to go to Erin.
All right. Hi, everyone. Let's see. I'm Erin Murphy, and I guess I'm one of the people that Betsy was referring to, is in the trenches. My experience with academia is not as lengthy as some of the people on the panel. So I am currently the press secretary for Governor Eric Holcomb, and that's in Indiana. And I've been in this role only since May, but prior to that, I was the Indiana Agency for Department of Child Services. Some people might know that as Child Protective Services. I was the communications director for that agency for about 3 years. And then prior to that, I was the communications director for the city of Westfield, again, an Indiana community that is north of Indianapolis, if you know the state's geography at all. And then before that, for about 12, 13 years, I was in TV news. And the people who trained me actually were Chuck and Betsy at IU. So it's great. It was a pleasure when she asked me about this. And then I did get my master's degree in public relations along the way. But so I am definitely in the trenches. I'm the one kind of communicating government issues, the good, bad, and ugly, and dealing with, I think, a very interesting time that I'm sure we'll discuss. But and I think that's about it. And I'm very grateful to be here. So thank you.
Thanks a lot, Erin. Jennifer, please, would you?
Hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer Glover-Conforst, and I am an associate professor at Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa. I lead our strategic political communication program there, where it's a relatively new major. It's about 7 years old. And we teach political communicators in a very practical way. I also serve as an Iowa state legislator. I am the minority leader in the Iowa House of Representatives. And so I do communication that way as well, of course. And I have something in common with Chuck in that I came up through public broadcasting. So I was communications director at Iowa Public Television for 12 years, and that's a state agency. So I did a lot of communication there as well. And in both of my roles as a legislator and as a faculty member, I'm working intensely or exclusively, no, considerably on work with students on ethical political communication, ethical government relations and communication, and making sure that we can sort of rebuild the brand of advocacy and government communication so that people like Erin and Chuck don't get such a hard time from some of our friends in the media. Most of us came up through media. I have a journalism degree as well. And I'm trying very hard to rebuild the brand of government communicators because it's really important work. So we're trying to do that as well.
Thanks a lot. So as everyone can see, this is a distinguished panel that can answer just about any question about government communication. And if you will please send us questions for them in the chat of this Zoom meeting, and we'll deal with those questions as we move through this conversation. We will also post links to all the panelists' online profiles in the chat. So if you want to read more about them, you can do so. We'll post that pretty soon. So let's start the conversation. And I think perhaps an appropriate opener is I'm asking the panelists to each respond to a general question of what are the philosophical and practical reasons for having government communication in contemporary democracies. So please go for it. Anybody who wants to go first.
Well, I can start things out. I think it's fundamental, and as I said, I'm informed by my journalism background, and I always felt like that communicators on this side should communicate, as Erin said, the good, bad, and the ugly, but really do that in a way that it creates the credibility that all of government agencies need to do what they need to do. The people need to feel like we are telling them what we can tell them. And yes, there are times that we can't tell them everything because things are still developing. There are things that need to be held back. But I think that truthfulness is a big part of how democracy works. And credibility is a big part of that. And we'll talk about this a lot, I'm sure, along the way today, but that is one of the things that we battle every day is credibility, and for obvious reasons that everybody is familiar with, but we'll get into that, I'm sure.
Vivian, do you want to jump in on that? I know you have specific ideas about this.
Right, thank you. Well, so I'm going to be speaking about a very specific form of government communication, and that is public diplomacy. So it might help perhaps for some of the folks here to have a bit of a definition. So public diplomacy is a government's way of communicating with external audiences to inform and influence behaviors and perceptions in the service of national foreign policy, national security, national prosperity objectives. It is very specifically a tool or an instrument of statecraft. And public diplomacy can combine elements of suasion or persuasion, linking it to soft power, of course, but there's also a transactional aspect of public diplomacy, or the use of the information instrument in general, that is giving something to get something, access to information in return for perhaps shifted behaviors or attitudes. And finally, there is the aspect of the use of the information instrument of power, which can be described as coercive, something that we know more familiarly as perhaps a disinformation or malign influence strategies. And so public diplomacy primarily focuses itself in the persuasive or soft power realm, but indeed operates along that whole spectrum from the persuasive to coercive, particularly when speaking about coercion, finding ways to respond to malign influence or disinformation strategies. So what is the relationship between the practice of public diplomacy and a democracy? Well, going back to the concept of soft power, and here I'm drawing upon Joe Nye's classic definition of same, where he talks about there are three elements of soft power that are important in international communication. And one is a state's ability to project its identity and values. The second is how its behaviors, its internal behaviors and its government is perceived. And finally, and how a state managed its relationships with others. But these qualities, the identity, the values, the policies, the external behaviors are the perceptions that exist in the mind of the observer, in the minds of the audience. And that's what's so challenging about public diplomacy, is that it is not merely a question of providing information, although that's an important part of it, about our country, about our policies, but it's also, and more subtly, used as a tool of influence, shaping attitudes toward those very policies in the hope of making them more attractive. So in a democracy, public diplomacy is a way to sort of take ownership of one's identity, national identity, policies, and interests. And the engagement in it, in and of itself, in a sense, models the democratic values. And it allows a country to establish a platform or a framework for pursuit of its objectives and interests, to project its legitimacy. And it is probably the best tool that we have in the global media space, for example, to not only project our own legitimacy, but, and in anticipation of, I think, another question that I know you want me to address, to provide a counterweight to authoritarian influence. In other words, attempts at disinformation. And disinformation is most effective when it targets vulnerabilities. And so I see the role of public diplomacy, particularly with respect to making the case for democracies, is that ability to provide a counterweight to authoritarian approaches to the use of information.
Erin, I want to put you on the spot next, as a different voice perhaps on this. We've gotten a very nice international view on this matter now, but you are, yes, in the trenches locally.
Yes. Yes. I think that having it's especially in a time now, I mentioned the ugly, and I think especially in my current role, the definition of a journalist, like who is a journalist? So I think the benefit of having a government communicator is very practical, and especially a time now, because I'm almost a buffer, which is needed, I think, in the world that we're in now with social media, the power of social media, the power of how fast people receive information and the sources they receive information, that you can't have, you need that protection. And I hate that I don't like that word, because it's not that my boss isn't doing something for the truest reasons or there's something shady going on, but there seems to be this gotcha culture that we have. And I will be honest, like just in this role in particular, on a national level, I get questions that are very loaded, and they're supposed to be journalists. And that's hard for me to understand, because I don't consider myself that out or outdated, but that's not what we were taught, and that's not the code of ethics. So I feel like, and I know this touches some of the other questions, but I feel like that is why you need it for just practical reasons, day-to-day reasons. And then it's just this is fact, but he doesn't have time to sit there and answer every single thing that's coming at him, because then what is he actually doing, and how is he moving toward objectives and his mission for the state, and handling things such as COVID. But yeah, I think it can be used as a weapon almost, right? Journalism. I mean, journalism is turned into a weapon for those who aren't following a code of ethics. And how do you navigate that so you make sure that the right information is getting out there and not being taken out of context, because that happens so much nowadays. And there's not the full story, that people don't have that background to understand because they're not given that information. So I don't know. So that's my take on the whole practicality of it. I think that it is crucial in a time that we have now, because anything can be taken out of context. And actually, we joke where if we take a picture of him, you always call it the Dukakis moment, where you have the, where he was wearing the helmet and he's in the tank, and that some say that ruined his chances. Now it's like just a tweet could be a Dukakis moment. It's not even just an image, which that was the power of imagery at the time, but it could be something that is well-intentioned, but because it's limited in characters, or someone's taken something he has said in a public event out of context on purpose, how damaging that could be. So that would be my take.
Erin, I can't resist doing a small follow-up with you here. I hear you. I mean, media are incredibly powerful. Visual media are, in my opinion, even more powerful, and they make and break government communicators or people in government. There is a new generation of politicians, people in government, who seem to be made out of Teflon. I mean, just nothing sticks to them. It doesn't matter what is being put out there about them. It doesn't affect them. It doesn't ruin Do you see that as well, or are you more experiencing the breaking of people in government?
I think it's almost scary, because I think the ones that seem to have that Teflon, I wonder where their moral compass is, because it seems to me, and I mean, maybe this shows a bias for me, but it seems to be the ones on the outer, the outliers, right, that don't seem to care also what is said about them or what they said. That they seem to be the ones that continue to thrive, because they also are a voice for these outliers. And I feel like the ones where that maybe are more traditional, that outliers, it seems to be, they want to take them down, and they want to find those weaknesses. However, and then truth and fact don't seem to matter. And I mean, I guess I could speak for myself personally. If I was in that situation, I would have a hard time then continuing to battle that day in, day out, and having that Teflon, if lies were being told about me. It's just, so I also think it seems to be this type of person that has kind of risen, that has Teflon and has given a voice to those who also seem to have Teflon themselves. I mean, I could get really political, but because you could talk about the COVID vaccine and how that narrative is being dispersed. But it seems to be that there are people in politics that they have one goal or one mission, and it does not matter what people say. And I guess it depends. You could look at that as a good thing or a bad thing.
Jennifer, I think this opens the ethics issue that's close to you, and would you like to comment?
Sure. Yeah, as someone who has things said about her on a regular basis, whether they're true or not, I can certainly relate to the challenge. I am most decidedly not one of the Teflon people. I certainly am affected by what people say. But yeah, I mean, I see the important role we have here, and I really value my journalism background, because it allows me to see the dual masters that we serve when we're doing the work of media relations. And Chuck can talk about this, and Erin can talk about this too, right? This is we're trying to, we have a responsibility to our profession and to our industry to persuade about our organizations. And it's tough, especially in crisis communication moments, which I'm sure, Erin, you're living with all the time, and probably you too, Chuck, but these constant moments of conflict, we have to really try to straddle that line. And there's a Joe Lockhart quote. Joe Lockhart was a Bill Clinton press secretary, and he said, I assume that if the president's a little mad at me and the press is a little mad at me on a given day, I've done my job. And it certainly feels that way quite a bit when, but I do think that we have a role beyond just our own supervisors and beyond our own organizations. We have a role, we have to uphold truth, trust, and credibility of our industry with the media and to the general public. I mean, if we're government communicators, we have an ethical responsibility to share information with the public that they deserve to know. And we have a responsibility to decide to push that envelope a little bit. When our bosses are saying, I don't want to tell this, I don't want to tell this, in the room, our job is to push, right? Our job is to say, yes, but they deserve to know. And that's hard to do, because we also want to keep our jobs, and we also understand the implications of sharing that information sometimes. I know in my career, there were times when I had to push my boss to do a TV interview, for example, that he didn't want to do because it was important. It was good for us. I mean, I'm not, solely, without, persuasion instincts, but it was important for our, for the media to have a relationship with them. It was important really for the public to know the information we needed to share, and it needed to come from my boss. And so that was a conversation we had to have that was relatively difficult. And that was one of those times when I felt that I was serving the general public's interest through media rather than solely my organization's interest. And this is, I think that you see the good folks who are doing this are the ones who understand that. The ones who are a little less ethical, the ones who are will say anything, will do anything, are the ones who maybe aren't serving the public good quite as much. And as government communicators, we have that responsibility. We can't shirk it just because we're mad at the people covering us, right? And I mean, Erin, you must walk that every day. I can only imagine. I do too. I've been misquoted more than I can count, and taken out of context and all that stuff. So wearing these two hats, I certainly see how that works from both the spokesperson side and the principal side.
So we've had a more or less American perspective on this now. So Agnieszka, I want to go to you and see how there might be similarities and differences to what you've already picked up is being discussed here from an American perspective.
Yeah, thank you. I certainly cannot give so detailed answer because I'm truly missing this political science background. But as a scholar, I think I can add to the discussion. And what Jennifer mentioned and what was kind of between the lines already when the others were speaking is this public good and this public interest. And I think that's the heart and the core of government communicators' everyday work. And this is also this philosophical grounding for how do we design every step we take as communicators, starting from planning to implementation. And in the core courses of strategic communication in our study program, we ground our teaching in the notion of stakeholder approach in communication, which says that actually we are in very close relationships with groups outside of organization. And we try to change this mindset of our students from thinking about them as target audiences, but as very equal partners in getting the goals of the organization achieved. So that's quite revolutionary for many of them, because as a young journalist, I saw the emergence of the profession of public relations specialist in my country, which still preserves in many government organizations that this idea that we can just go on with this one directional communication and have these certain specific target audiences, still rely very much on media relations to get our message through. But that's not the way how we want our students to think. So we want to kind of put in front this stakeholder approach and thinking about these different groups we are working with. And this brings additional challenges because there is this multiplicity of stakeholders. And when you start thinking, when you start mapping, so who are those you must be in this relationship and in this very complex interplay with? So that's my kind of reply to your question.
I think what we all hear you say from different perspectives and in different ways, that the game is changing. So I want to ask the pointed question that do governments and government communicators have an obligation to counter misinformation or disinformation? And I want to go back to Vivian on this. I think she's got some very specific thoughts on that.
Yes, thank you. And I will, at the same time, try to address the excellent question from Russell Valentino, who along those lines. I don't know if all of you can see that, but I'll try to speak to that as well. So the big challenge is how to use soft power tools in an environment an information environment that is very often much more aligned with sharp or hard power use of tools, particularly when dealing with narratives that emerge from, for example, the People's Republic of China or from the Russian Federation. Russell's excellent question is, how do you, aren't the Russian and Chinese and other authoritarian regimes using similar tools? Well, yes and no. there are aspects to the practice of public diplomacy that are very much embedded in the democratic tradition. And those practices are easily distinguished from Chinese and Russian and other approaches by the virtue of the fact that, for example, concept of transparency, openness, and openness in discussing sources and information, transparency in being very clear and upfront about what policies are, a respect for individual privacy, the degree to which when we talk about reaching out and understanding audiences, how we target audiences and what we know what those audiences are very much governed by rules about the kind of information we can access and use. Our funding practices, the fact that we are dependent on a certain amount of accountability to the Congress, to the executive branch, as well as to the American people with how we use our resources, the money that we spend on them. And that's a great deal of what I do in the reports that I work on. All of these are qualities that help to maintain our credibility in the global information space. Russian disinformation narratives and Chinese disinformation narratives or influence strategies are not necessarily credible. If you you have no sense that you can rely on what it is that they're putting out. So to maintain a credibility in the global information space is a question of adhering to these practices. So I think that's what distinguishes the two. But with respect to actually countering disinformation, I think that actually going toe to toe and responding point by point to a particular narrative is simply fruitless. You know, it's like having two people argue with one another. The audience in the middle will hear one version of the story and then another version of the story and be unable and really, frankly, uninterested in figuring out who's right or wrong. Now, providing access to fact checking, absolutely. Relying on platforms where people can go and get information, absolutely important. But it's not a question of direct confrontation. On the tactical level, certainly something that the Department of State has done quite a bit is focus on not only the development of these fact-checking platforms, but targeted training programs, media literacy programs, providing people with the tools and the understanding they need to be able to assess information in their own time and on their own terms. This also means providing support for independent media in those countries. Those are on the tactical level, a number of things. There are a number of things that you can do to counter disinformation effects rather than disinformation itself. And then finally, I would say that was tactical. If you think about it on the strategic level, as I said earlier, disinformation is most successful when it attacks certain vulnerabilities, when people feel disenfranchised, when they feel that their government is not taking care of them, or for there may be historical or social or economic reasons. And good disinformation narratives exploit those fears and vulnerabilities. And so the longer term investment in cooperation with host countries in working on building democratic institutions, reinforcing civil society institutions, that's where ultimately the resilience to disinformation is developed.
And this brings me to another excellent question from an anonymous attendee, saying that this very project that the Department of State is funding, the project between KMA and Indiana, if that is that soft diplomacy that you've talked about, Vivian, can you say a little more about that?
Yes, exactly. This is the aspect of public diplomacy that focuses, this is the middle and long-term investment in education and professional training. And absolutely a very important part of what the Department of State does. If you think about public diplomacy, and there's here I'll use Nick Cull's taxonomy of information and influence. If you haven't read Nick Cull's writing on public diplomacy, I highly recommend it. He's a scholar based at the University of Southern California at the Center on Public Diplomacy. The most important aspect of public diplomacy, of course, is listening, understanding your audiences. Audiences come first, but the next aspect of public diplomacy is what I referred to earlier in terms of short-term advocacy, getting out the message, establishing your policies, your platforms, where you're coming from, where you're going, and then responding to crises or issues as they come. But then the real long-term investment of public diplomacy is in education and exchange programs, where through the Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs and the Department of State, there are more than 90 separate education and outreach programs that seek, among other things, in the case of this particular project, to reinforce academic institutions, to enable enable professors and students to find fresh approaches to thinking about, in this case, questions of journalism and outreach. That's a very important part of the overall State Department effort to support democratic institution building around the world. And also, going back to what I said earlier, definitely models democratic practice and process.
I want to turn the conversation back to the idea of the responsibility or not of governments and government communicators to counter disinformation. We've heard from Vivian that she thinks that going toe-to-toe, point by point is not a productive way to try and counter, that empowering people might be the better route to countering disinformation. But I'd like to hear from some of the people in the trenches again, how this plays out in your daily lives when there is a piece of disinformation circulating, how that is received in your work environment, and how does that get debated and thought through, and what do you ultimately do when that happens? Chuck, do you want to go?
Yeah, so it happens with more frequency than I imagined it would in this role. This last year and a half has been its own test case with COVID. And you all may be aware that Indiana University was one of the first, certainly the largest public institution in the country to mandate the COVID vaccination for students, faculty, and staff. That received quite a bit of blowback, and we still are. That one got me my favorite nickname from an anonymous emailer that I get called around the office a lot, which is Truly Evil. So now I'm known as Truly Evil Chuck Carney. You have to pick your battles on these things. With things like the COVID vaccine, there were things we had to take on head on. There are things that there are rumors that go around college campuses and universities that you have to knock down on occasion. But what really, I think, as I was listening to the points being made about not necessarily taking things on point by point, I totally agree with that. You have to pick who it's worth doing that with. One of the things I never envisioned in this role, and it really kind of is against where I came up as a journalist, and I tell people, if you cut me, I bleed journalist, because that's really where I started all this. And I really, really believe in proper journalism. But the fact is, and I know it has to be true in Ukraine, and it certainly is true in the United States, there are some outlets that I just have to, even though they look like they're journalists, they are not. And there are, I can tell you that there are a couple of outlets that I just simply do not respond to, because as Erin referred to the loaded questions, their entire approach to it is loaded. They're not coming at me trying to get the truth of something. They're coming at me to create an incident. And you have to be able to recognize that. And that is part of my job as well. Erin also talked about being a buffer. My job is to make sure that I'm the one out there speaking on something that's worthy of being spoken to, and sometimes speaking instead of having our president or some other administrative figure speaking about it. It's better that I speak to it, but sometimes it's just not worth our time. It's not worthy of the institution. It's a waste of what we do, and it's also not productive. That has become a much bigger part of what we do, and I think that in terms of the bigger picture of democracy and how it serves those purposes, that's really important for a communicator to select and decide and determine. That is a disheartening part of the job, I will tell you, because again, I believe in journalism, and I really think that there's good journalism being done. And I believe that people should ask me difficult questions that are hard to answer. That's my job, is to answer those questions. But I think that my job is to evaluate that, and not make a judgment on whether I think that they should be doing the story even, but it's to evaluate the merits of getting into that mud fight.
Erin?
Yes, I agree with everything he said. No, I will say, since this is probably, well, this is my most high profile job that I've had. The not responding drives me crazy. Like, me not responding to a journalist, it's really been something that I'm having to be okay with. But while we're talking, I got an email from someone that is asking me just loaded questions from a very targeted journalism piece. I don't even know what to call them, but it's very one-sided, and there's what they're going to write is very obvious just by what they're asking me. And I have to just be like, nope, I'm not going to respond, but I want to so bad. And that's so hard for me, because I think that is the role, to be responsive, right? That's part of the role. But it's this whole, you can't trust someone just because they say they're a journalist. So that's been very challenging for me. The whole, the correcting information, it is a lot of going back and forth internally, because there's, in particular, we have another politician who likes to just, we say poke. He likes to poke our governor, and he constantly issues these press releases. So he's one of those that we just don't, we don't respond. We don't respond to when the governor's just asked point blank in a media scrum. He has a very canned response, just so he's not poking back, because then it does become this back and forth. And then what, in the end, you don't even know what the topic was to begin with, what that information was. That gets lost, because now you're just going back and forth politically. So that, for instance, that is someone that I won't correct the information. Like, it is what it is. But then yesterday we had two legislators that were asking the governor to do something, and wrote him a letter, and then did a press conference here in the State House. And we worked on correcting the information and sent it to a journalist that asked us. Not everyone asked us. I didn't go and put out another release, because then that does turn, because there is an essence of politics with that. So I'm not going to sit there and just go play that game. But when a valid journalist asked me that information, and he also is one that follows this very closely, he's a State House reporter. So I knew what I was giving him, he was going to understand. He wouldn't take it out of context. And so that was a time that we found it very valuable to send him information that he needed, so he'd understand the whole story, than just this one press release that's being issued by two legislators. So I think it's definitely It is something that in my head, when I first get an email or if I see something that's wrong, it's like, all right, what am I going to do? What are my options? I'm like, what are the options? And then I go through them. And then sometimes it is like an internal conversation and with the governor, like, what do we want to do? And what will it mean? Will we be properly informing the public? Or does it turn into he said, she said, back and forth over Twitter? So.
Wow. So, Agnieszka, I wonder, does this ring true for you? Is this how adversarial government communication gets in Latvia? I mean, could you give us a perspective?
Yeah, when you say the word disinformation in the geographical territory where I am located, so it's the first association usually is Kremlin backed disinformation campaigns in countries like Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Ukraine as well, and there's basically this Eastern and Central and Eastern Europe. So that's the first thing that will come to our minds when you ask about disinformation. And what we have spotted as one of the main challenges, and I would also definitely respond that whether should we counter this disinformation. Of course, I would say no, because we would amplify whatever is there, and that's not what we want to do. But what to do? What can we do, basically? And what is the problem with Latvian communication is that we lack some strategic narratives, basically, about us, who we are, and where do we want to go from this point forward. So that it's in this vacuum, basically, that's where this disinformation lands. And I think that's what causes most of the problems that we are currently facing. And just to add on what Vivian was talking about, as a media literacy trainer and working with different groups like journalists, librarians, teachers, also school students, that I think what is very relevant is this Potter's cognitive media literacy theory, which says that basically we cannot equip people with practical skills and knowledge. What is this information, how to spot it, and how to evaluate fact and distinguish it from an opinion and so on. But this cognitive aspect of what resonates with us and why do we become perceptive to disinformation. So this is something what needs to be studied more in detail, and that's also what we have included in our strategic communication and governance study program. We have study courses that talk about human cognition. So this is very important for the government communicators to be, or the ones already in the profession, to understand that it's not just about equipping people with certain tools and certain skills, that there is much more we need to take into consideration when we speak about disinformation and what to do with this.
I see, Vivian, your hand is up. I think you want to respond to something, correct?
I do, and I don't have much time either, unfortunately. So, but I wanted to respond to what Agnes was saying. In my experience, and I've looked at the problem of disinformation quite a bit in Ukraine, although that's not what brought me to Ukraine this time, but also in the Republic of Georgia, and I've looked at it in other countries as well. But I've slowly coming to the conclusion that just like we say about in America about all politics is local, I think the most dangerous disinformation and the most powerful is actually local. And in other words, it may parrot aspects of the Kremlin's disinformation narrative, which is pretty straightforward. You'll find anti-Western values, anti-Soros, depending on where you are, anti-EU, anti-NATO. You'll find all of those elements. Can be a Kremlin narrative, but I have seen far-right elements in Georgia produce exactly similar narratives. And I've seen Orban's Fidesz people in Budapest, in Hungary, put out similar narratives. So another thing, I think the most pernicious thing about disinformation is that it's elements of discontent, disenfranchisement, all of those are easily and readily co-opted internally as well. And we could probably talk a little bit about the United States and that will, but I won't right now. The other thing I wanted to point out in agreeing very much with Agnes's point about the need for narrative, in other words, what is the alternative to the disinformation narrative, right? What can a country say about itself? And there, I think that's a great question. My answer goes back to what I started with, which is Joseph Nye and those elements of what makes a country credible in the perception of the global audience. And that is quality and values. Are those attractive and interesting? Do they resonate externally? So a narrative that somehow captures the values and identity, an agreed upon identity of a country. A narrative that talks about how that country manages its relationships, both internally and externally, telling stories about the country, its aspirations. In the case of Ukraine, for example, and talking about NATO membership, what aspects of what NATO, Ukraine has already contributed to NATO make it a obvious partner for future such operations. So the point being, finding stories about that country within those areas, and then making a counter narrative, building a counter narrative from those elements. A counter narrative that ultimately frustrates the original messaging intent of the source of disinformation. So
yeah, it almost sounds like you're suggesting a inoculation kind of process, even where one is not just putting out fires, but that you also have a coherent narrative.
Right, and I guess I made that point, is that you have to have something, you have to have a story to tell, but you also have to understand that your story has to be based not necessarily on your country's vision per se, but to some degree, what the rest of the world, or at least those audiences you want to reach, what they think, what are their pre-existing conceptions and perceptions, and how do you need to change those perceptions to serve your country's interests. But I do think that narrative is a vehicle. And with that, I'm unfortunately, so I'm on my last evening of work in Kyiv, so I need to hop off. But I wanted to thank you very much for this invitation, and I truly enjoyed this conversation. And I think you have my contact information, and if anyone has any questions or wants to follow up with me, please feel free to share my contact information so that I can continue the conversation with folks who perhaps have felt that they wanted to know more or learn more about these issues.
We really appreciate you spending this time with us. We know how busy all of you are, but you in particular out on a job there. The rest of us will continue, and we'll be in touch. Thanks so much, Vivian.
Thank you so
Enjoy
much.
your trip.
Yeah. Virtually.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
So Jennifer, I want to turn to you and ask if you want to reflect on that, disinformation issue. And I also want to point you to a question that we've gotten that I think is somehow related. And it's a question from Yuri, who says, one can do this kind of counter move to this disinformation by creating grand platforms and putting out the right information to counter disinformation. But how do you get people to go there to see it? Right. So this very idea of countering it by putting alternative information out there. How do we get there?
Right.
If you can address that and anything else related to this disinformation topic.
Well, surely if I could address that, I would be on a yacht somewhere, because I've made so much money off of my efforts, and I've saved democracy. So, that would be great. But I think the first step is I agree with this concept of not feeding the beast and how hard that is. My entire career, I've said we should never say no comment to a reporter. It's been a sort of ethic of mine that you don't do that. I've taught my students not to do that. I can't say that anymore because, I have people on my phone that start with "do not answer," like, because I just know who they are. And look, then the problem becomes when that gets meshed in with traditional, more mainstream media, because where's the line between they were unfair and they have an agenda and I'm mad at what they covered, but traditionally when do you ice them out and when do you not? And where's the line? And it moves, which is really hard, because there are plenty of folks who say, sure, I have an agenda, but I'm a legitimate journalist and I'm doing legitimate work. Do you not talk to them because they have an agenda that disagrees with you? And then is that actually just perpetuating a misinformation campaign that you're not countering, right? So it's all very difficult to find the line, and especially when it keeps moving. So I do think that answer of feeding the beast and speaking to partisan or agenda-based media is a moving target for those of us who do media relations and those of us who are in this work on a daily basis on the ground. With regard to how do we reach people and get them to engage with misinformation, or counter to misinformation, they don't have any trouble engaging with misinformation. I think that it's entertainment, right? We need to find a way to make this information entertaining, engaging, and we need to meet people where they are. Too often we find ourselves putting up platforms, putting up, great information, amazing information out there, and no one will ever go there because it's not, there's no incentive for them to, it's not where they are. We need to understand our audiences well enough to know, and as we've heard, starting with audience is most important. We need to understand our audiences well enough to know where they are and how we can get the information to them. I think a lot of times what happens is those of us who work in government communication who did come up through journalism have a strong sense of respect for mainstream media, or at least the profession of journalism. And so we tend to diminish in our minds our perspective on those who don't engage in traditional media as less than, as not as smart, as mistaken. And when we do that, we dismiss an entire audience. And then that audience only gets one side of information. So when one side is respecting an audience and one is ignoring them, of course you're going to listen to the people who are respecting you. So we need to go, and instead of looking down our noses at those people who are engaging with this partisan media, we need to figure out why they're there, what they're getting from them, and how we can, I'm not saying partisan media only spreads misinformation. I don't mean to conflate the two, but I mean in this sense. So sources of misinformation for them, how are they getting them? And then how can we go where they are and create content that they truly want to engage with? And then a lot of that also, unfortunately, comes from testimonial work. So how do we get third-party endorsers who are credible with these audiences to truly advance the true information? So it's not an easy thing. It's that old quote about, a lie can make its way around the world while the truth is still tying its shoes. It's hard to do, and this is not new. And I think that's important to remember too, is that misinformation has been around since the Spanish-American War, since, long before that even. And so we have to understand that we're fighting a long-term battle here, but the tools we're using to fight it are currently not working. So, and I think that comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of the audience that is receptive to misinformation.
Yeah, Betsy, can I pick up on a quick point on that? So, one of the things that I think that also pairs with the misinformation part, and I know this is true, Betsy, you and I have seen students, and we had excellent ones like Erin years ago, who are highly media literate, but also critically thinking literate. Critical thinking is a huge problem right now. And so this other audience that we're talking about, there is an enormous lack of critical thinking. And I see the social media age has led to a lot of changes in behavior. And I hold as a prop, New York Times I've had no time to open this week. This is, I think, a couple of days old. but nonetheless, I try to read the New York Times hard copy, and I've done this since I was a kid. Students these days are not raised with a hard copy of the paper. It changes the way you engage with text, and it changes the way that you take in information. You're used to getting short blurbs, and I'm sure I'm probably not alone. I know that the way I read has changed. It makes it very difficult, for instance, to sit down and read an academic journal article these days, because the way you engage with things is so, let's pick up something really quick. Well, the problem that we have now in the big sense for what we do is that we're dealing with entire audiences who are picking up snippets from social media, and they don't have the complex understanding of some things. And so if you're trying to demonstrate government processes, if you're trying to talk about why it's necessary to have a vaccine mandate at a university, you know, all of these things, if you don't have them in a short sentence, they're not going to be taken in, or they're going to be dismissed, because there is no understanding of the rest of this, and there's no critical reading of the disinformation that's coming in. And that, I think, is one of our greatest issues that we have going forward right now. And I will tell you, as great as our students are at Indiana University, I fight it with students all the time, and it really. It's why current events quizzes are really important to continue to have in classes and things like that. They got to read, they got to understand, and they've got to be able to dismiss some of this thing, because they just understand it's more complex than it's being demonstrated here. And Jennifer, you wanted to
Jennifer wants to say something.
Sorry, Chuck, I just wanted to build on that, because this critical thinking aspect is key. I hear it from employers all the time that they wish that their students or that their employees had more critical thinking skills. And it's one of those things that the value of higher education is in building this ability to think critically. And we as journalists have to really push that hard and ask the whys and force them to think critically. And then the other thing I would say is that I start every class with, tell me what's going on in the world today, for that exact reason, because I need them. And then they will, at the beginning of the semester, without fail, every year, they will give me headlines and tweets. And I'll be like, tell me more about that. And then they don't have any additional information. And so I do think that you're absolutely right that this focus on critical thinking is key. My concern comes in with this generation that graduated from college 5-7 years ago, that's now in the field without this critical thinking, many of them without that, who are now starting to be in positions of authority at newsrooms, in media organizations that don't have those skills or those foundations. How do we reach them as well? So I just wanted to build on what Chuck said there. Also, Chuck, my daughter goes to college in South Bend, not at IU South Bend, but at Notre Dame, and they had a vaccine mandate too. And my daughter was relieved that IU did one, because then she could leave campus from time to time. So thank you.
Oh, that's good to hear.
Agnesi, I see your hands up, please.
Yeah, I want to expand a little bit on this, because I have a great fear that the term critical thinking might become as empty as fake news became after certain politicians started using it as a label for everything they didn't want to hear or what was against their own beliefs and opinions. And because in Latvia, by this critical thinking, too often I see that people understand being critical or doubting everything. So it's losing the original notion. And I recently finished a project proposal on, and I hope it to be approved, on science literacy. And I think as educators, we need to take much of this blame on ourselves, that actually the educational systems are failing to teach critical thinking alongside with science literacy, with health literacy, with political literacy, all this family of literacies that somehow we all consider very relevant, very important, but we have lost the ability to teach it in some way. I don't know, how has it slipped through these educational programs? I have no idea currently.
Very good point. Truly a critical point, as well. And you've all really opened the conversation now to this educational, pedagogical angle. And we've talked quite a bit about the audience and their literacies, as Agnese has pointed out here. I want to shift it a little bit to the pedagogy and education of future government workers. I think we've also heard from the conversation here that the game has changed dramatically. So I'm asking all of you, what should a curriculum that's training future government communicators, what should that curriculum have? Where are our blind spots in training, truly training future government workers for the current media ecosystem and the changes that we've seen? I wonder, Agnese, do you want to start this off?
So it's going to be quite specific for the local context where we developed our study program. You can afterwards tell how relevant it is for you. But there are going to be several aspects I want to emphasize. First, when we started developing our study program, what we realized is that we cannot simply focus on teaching communication. So that it must be much broader spectrum of subjects to be integrated and included. And I already mentioned this human cognition. So it's basically some psychology must be inserted, as well as the political science theories of democracy. What we are teaching sustainable development, also management, strategic management of organizations. And this brings us the change management, which we recently started, which brings me to the specific problem, probably which I tackled a little bit, is the position in this, where is the communication located in contemporary government organizations? Is it part of this dominant coalition, or is it still kind of support function? That's the main question. And unfortunately, in Latvia, we have to tell that it's still this support function in very many places. You will see that this communication cannot be and is not implemented as strategic communication. That we, in a way, have stuck in this. What is this media relations mindset, something, and that what we want with this study program is kind of, okay, call it our mission. We want these specialists, when they return to the organization, or when they start a new position as public sector communicators, that they try to push this idea that they are part of this dominant coalition in the organization. They are part of this group responsible for the achievement of the organization's strategic goals. So it's not support function anymore, that we must take communication very seriously. And therefore, we try to keep our admission requirements also very open, and we invite not only communication specialists, the ones becoming or already being in the field, but also the managers of the organization, the heads of the institutions, so that they, in a way, also question the current position of communication in their organizations, and to see whether they really are achieving what they want to achieve with this current designs, this organizational design. So where is the communication kind of located currently? Do they sit at the table with the big guys when the big decisions are taken? So that's the core question.
Yeah. Oh, I really enjoyed what you've mentioned, and I'm going to take the liberty of lifting 2 points that I think are really central out of what you've discussed. And it's almost like maybe we should make a list of all the ideas that you have here, and keep that list as we think about future training. And the one idea is this one that you ended with, that we train future government communicators to walk into their first job and say, where's the communication located? And understand how they are positioned in that context, and to push to get to the table. So that's a lovely skill to actually train students to recognize and assess when they walk into these jobs. And I think I also hear you go back to the audience to argue that we need to train future government communicators to understand their audience, right? To understand the cognition of most, how most people respond to information. So those 2 points I think are absolutely, I think from my perspective, new insights. And so I'm making a list here with insights. I wonder if we can go to Jennifer next. Did we lose her?
She lost her Wi-Fi, so she is trying to get back on.
Okay, Chuck, would you mind going next in thinking if you get a break from Indiana University and say, go back and take any class you want. What do you think would help you do your job today?
Well, I'll tell you how I can reply to that is actually some classes that I have taken that I think were really helpful. So I just finished a PhD about a year and a half ago, finally, after you're working on it for about a decade. And one of the things that I did within that was my minor was in the O'Neill School in public policy. And there were so many things about just systems and the way things work and the way decisions are made that I didn't really understand before that. My major was higher education. And so for the role in which I'm in now, that was really important. And now how much I didn't understand before. And one of the things that you battle in communicating about what you do in any role that has a government part of it is that everybody assumes they know how things work because they interact with certain parts of it. Education is especially true in that realm. K-12 gets it more than anybody else because everybody's gone to elementary and high school in this country, and they figure, well, they know how that works. And so they can tell you how decisions ought to be made. Higher education gets that a bit too, for everybody who's ever gone to college on any level. But the understanding of how decisions have to be made, what goes into it, is so key. So among the things that I'd like to continue to do is to keep up with where those changes are in just how the complexities work. So things in the area in which I work, I took enrollment management in my program, and I like to say just enough to be dangerous. I don't really understand it completely at all. It's some sort of voodoo that they do that makes it all work. But I'd like to know more about that and how it works, recruiting students. I think that that's certainly true for things. I mean, if I were put it into a government context, a large government context, it would be things like, some of the basics that touch everybody, road repair. I am sure Erin's office here all the time about, well, we got Highway 72 out here that's just all beat up and you guys don't do nothing about it. And, how do you assess these things and how do those decisions get made? The only way you can transmit the complexity in a simple way is to understand how complex it is so that you can translate it for the people you're trying to reach. And it can be very difficult. It certainly has proven so in the age of the pandemic. And sometimes we don't do it very well. Sometimes we do it better than others, but your job is to understand it well enough that you can put it into other words that other people who do not have that background can understand, and understand that you were once in that area where you didn't know that.
Okay, so here are 2 points I'm taking from you, and that is the training in a sense where one can reduce clutter and complexity to the more or less essences that would help people understand complicated things, and to do that in a fairly succinct way. And with that, yeah, a way to really understanding the organization that you work for, and all its layers and complexities, which really meets up well with that idea of Agnese, where she talked about understand where the communication is located, right? But
and
yeah.
I would just one quick reading recommendation. One of the things that really sort of transformed my thinking on a lot of stuff is there's a book about Robert Moses that was written. I'm forgetting the famed author's name. He's written a bunch about Lyndon Johnson as well, but there's a book about Robert Moses who basically built the modern New York City. I didn't know anything about Robert Moses, but anything that you see in New York City has his touch on it. He was ruthless. He was not exactly ethical in how he behaved, but reading it was fascinating in learning about how some of these things can work and what the thinking was. And you can say that there was a public good that came out of some of what he did, while he also definitely harmed people. But it was an eye-opening book, and one of the first ones I read in my program, where I was sort of like, I realized that complexity there, and that decisions have real impact on people. There are whole neighborhoods in New York City that are gone. That was because he decided to build a highway through there, and whoever lived there, tough. So that's my reading recommendation regarding the complexities of government.
So Erin, I'm coming to you now and asking if you could make a comeback to our fine campus for some extra coursework.
I know, right?
What would that be?
I think for me, the whole complex issue thing, I think that does speak to me, but and this is my lack of academia, I guess, experience and knowing how you'd break that down. But being a journalist, especially a TV journalist, when you have a day turn, you have to understand complex issues and then communicate in a way that your audience understands it. But then the next day you might go on to something else. You usually do. So what I've learned, especially, I think for me, my most complex, my experience into really complex issues is DCS. It is very complex. And I worked there 3.5 years, and I understand like the icing on the cake, right? Like I barely understand it, but you have journalists, mainstream journalists, that reputable journalists that are asking questions. And when you try to even get them to understand like the step further, they say they do, but they never do. And you're like, no, you really don't get it. And it's just, and then they end up communicating it completely wrong. So that happened very often. So I think that's actually very key, but I think it's this, how can you really communicate and inform a public correct or accurately when you go topic to topic to topic, and they're really usually very complex and in the weeds. And I think that's so challenging for especially TV journalists, those day turn journalists. And so I think understanding how to properly cover, and I guess that's that critical thinking piece, understanding complex issues. I think that all can be wrapped up into that, because these are, as Chuck was also stating about the New York City reference, really, really complex issues. And with DCS, it's life and death. I mean, it literally is, and it's people's lives at stake. And it's not as easy as just saying it's this agency's fault, this social worker's fault, this mom's fault. It's not that easy. So that's something, and I don't know how even to get my arms around that, I guess on a college campus maybe, but and then the other thing is I'm going to bring in my the other thing I took classes in at IU was gender inequities they're very present in the communications world, at least the United States. I will only assume elsewhere. But I think what you run into, and I have run into this in my career, is that the people in charge are usually male, and the big decision makers are male, and then the communicators are female, and they're not at the table, and they're not treated as equals. That is something that I am against all the time. And I think that I haven't been able, I speak up for myself. I'm very assertive. That has helped me, I think, in my career, but I'm definitely, it's the whole, anyway, what people say about you, you shouldn't have to worry, right? And because that is not always deemed as a good quality. But that has definitely helped me in my career. But I think things like that, I only know to speak up because of my education at IU when it came to the gender classes I took. So I think that's very prevalent, still is prevalent, and it's hard because the majority of communicators are female and the majority of leaders are male. So
Erin, I again can't help asking if there are students in the Zoom conversation who are really excited about working in government communication. I'm not just talking about women. I think many men would really like to work on this problem too. Do you have any direct advice for them right now?
right now,
On how to manage the gender landscape in government communication?
I think speak up in a professional way, and also pick your battles. I had to learn that the hard way in my professional life. Being able to speak up and assert yourself you shouldn't do it all the time, because then you won't be taken seriously as much when you really are, when you really mean to. But for men and women, speak up, share your piece. I think it was mentioned about how if my boss is upset with me and the media is upset with me, I'm doing my job. And I remember in journalism, if people are saying bad things about you, you're usually doing a good job. So you're not always going to be liked. I think that's something that is having a thick skin, knowing you're not always going to be liked. That's also just a life learned skill. But really being okay with it and moving on and understanding what is the long-term goal and why are you fighting for this particular situation or issue. But I think that's really, I just think in my experience, speaking up has always been helpful and key in getting to the table, or at least getting closer to the table.
Excellent. So Erin, from you on my list, I've taken notes on training or preparing future government communicators to embrace the idea of variety, that not a single day looks the same. One day you have to delve into very complicated things and simplify them. The next day it's something completely different that doesn't require that skill. So yeah, you need to be able to embrace variety and a reasonably thick skin to deal with a gender environment and navigational skills to handle that. And then I hear you echo Chuck's idea that you have to be able to take complicated things and not only make it clear to an audience, but to journalists and help them understand complicated things. That is yeah, please.
Yeah, and I just want to add, because you did mention how there are people that might be listening that are communicators or want to be communicators that in government that are men. And that's the flip side, is obviously there is gender issues with that as well, right? Like what they will face by, I think that could be helpful for them in their career, or maybe it's not, depending on who's at the top, who's leading, and what are their perceptions or stereotypes of men in those roles. So again, speaking up and being assertive and being true to why you're there and what your reason for being there is and what your job is I think going to help you. So I just wanted to mention that too.
So what you're saying is that you still see men who want to transcend the gender issue getting put into awkward and less favorable positions because they have that more pluralistic view of the field.
I
Right?
think so. I think a lot of times you'll find men who are leading communications for organizations that maybe didn't have that background, right? They're put there in a leadership role and they're at the table, but you're like, if you look at their background, you're like, interesting. But if you went as an entry level and you're a man and you're at a communications coordinator, how are you being perceived and treated? I don't think fair. And I mean, I'm assuming, and I'm going by stereotypes, but I would argue that you probably aren't being treated fair. So.
Chuck, sorry, but yeah.
I know, Chuck.
Do you recognize this? Do you what is your advice?
Your take.
Yeah, well, I think well, I can speak from my own standpoint. I mean, my direct boss is a woman. The president of IU now is a woman, and I work almost, gosh, it's probably 7 to 3 in my direct team that I work with, and my direct report is a female. And I have 2 daughters. And so, I would say Erin's advice of speaking up, man, that is something that we have really told my oldest daughter, who graduated from IU last year and is now in grad school, to do. And she does, and she comes by that honestly, not so much from me, but her mother, who is very, very much somebody who does speak up. But yeah, I think that men in these roles need to, and let me, before I say this, I don't want to give any impression that I understand everything about gender and I'm the perfect example of how all this works, because I'm certainly not. But you need to understand perspectives and treating people in the way that they should be treated. It honestly, I will say this, and I hesitate to say this because it sounds like I'm making an inflated statement, but it never really crosses my mind with the people I work with, because they're so good, and they treat me well, and they're vital to what we do, and that's kind of where you need to get it. Just but at the same time, I do recognize that there is a perspective that I miss sometimes by being a white male, that I really have to be cognizant of. And I think anywhere you're doing communications, you need to be cognizant of that perspective. And I was thinking, as we were discussing too, about perspectives, the Robert Moses book actually was a good example, but I'm trying to read a diversity of things that I've never read before, things I wouldn't normally read, to try to pick up more of a diverse idea of where people come from. And so I've started to pick up some books that just to pick them up because they look sort of interesting, but I would never have read before. Those are little things you can do to try to help that perspective. And they don't all have to be really, really heavy. I'm talking about fiction books that just provide that different idea. And so I think that it's an eternal quest to try to find what your perspective should be and how you should understand other people. And that's true in any walk of life, but in communications, if you're going to reach those people in our roles, you really have to be able to do that to at least some extent.
Agnese, I saw you earlier when Erin was talking. I saw you nodding quite a bit, and I want to give you a chance to respond to this gender issue.
It just struck me because I don't have any kind of data on this, but when Erin was speaking, it kind of resonated with what I have observed, is that politics in Latvia is unfortunately a man thing still. And when she was saying that, yeah, in these communication positions, you will find women. So I would say that this might be true here as well. So that explains a lot, probably, often. And Erin, you inspire me a lot, and when you were talking about these everyday struggles and these lessons you have learned, and these probably very simple advices, but when you are in these everyday situations, I cannot imagine how difficult it has been for you to stand for yourself and kind of, yeah, being 1000% sure for what you are doing and repeating it to yourself every day and not letting yourself maybe question also. That's something that inspired me a lot. So thank you.
I want to ask one more question related to gender, and anybody, anybody can respond as, in no specific order, but I wonder in government communication, if there aren't certain topics or moments that gender becomes important, and the gender of the spokesperson could help or hurt to navigate something difficult. Erin, there I'm picking on you again. Have you noticed that you could also use the fact that you are a woman to address things more effectively from that perspective?
Yes, and I do want to say, Chuck, I was not singling you out by any means. I know you've earned your spot very well, and I obviously you taught me. So, but I will say, just in politics, I'll just speak government, especially since this is obviously what we're talking about, because I did work in local politics too, which that I in my experience was very prevalent. So I will say this, but I do think our current governor does not have children. So I will say that. Now, he has asked me directly about certain things related to children and vaccines and schools, because I am a woman and I have children, that's great. Now, what I would say, if I was a man, he still would make the same decisions. He wasn't changing any decisions. I will say my case or speak my case to him, but he wants more of me just to confirm what he is already doing is good, right? So that I think is one area that I've noticed here in my current role. But I also think, and I know that there's been, I'm sure there's been studies on this, and I could not think of any right now, but when you're talking about authoritative figures, so we had in our state, our governor is male and he's in his 50s, and he was giving his weekly updates on COVID in the thick of it. And now he was with our health commissioner, who was a female, an older female, and she, Dr. Box. And so they're both giving this, and it was great seeing this. And I trusted them and I valued them. But I also wonder if Dr. Box, I don't know, it's this whole thing where, how do people perceive that authoritative figure? And is it because I know that from going way back, learning in news anchors, usually you have the older white gentleman who's delivering the news, right? The Walter Cronkites, and you're valuing what they're saying, but you want the younger female who might be prettier, and that's who you want by his side. But you might not trust her as much. You trust Walter Cronkite to deliver the news. And I don't know if we're completely out of that, because anyway, I know I'm not I don't know if I'm making sense. I don't have real statistics to back up what I'm saying, but I think that when you have males in leadership roles in maybe communities who are not as progressive, I think there's a reason they're there, and that the reason why you can't change that easily is because people have a hard time looking at maybe females, and you could obviously minorities, looking at them as authoritative figures that they trust, and they trust what they're saying. I definitely could see that in my local community, because there are people that I know. One woman I love and adore, and she's so valuable and she's informative and educated. She ran for city council against someone else who spreads disinformation in our community, and she lost. Why? It was baffling to me. She has children in our schools. She's a professional, but he's an older man, and I don't know, and I don't have the statistics, like I said, to back it up. I don't know the demographics of who was voting that day, I also just know the conversations in our communities, and I worked in that government agent or for that government. I know who is the leader, who the leadership is, and who is at the council. At the time was one female, all men, white men who were over the age of like 55, 60. So anyway, okay, I could go on and on. And
Yeah,
again, nothing against Chuck.
I am going to put on the list perhaps, and that is really the job of academics. Yeah, Agnese, you and I have to get busy in studying what female leadership and female leadership credibility would look like. I mean, what are the barriers now? Because I think there have been there are shifts in some circles among specific people. Agnese, I see you have your hand up, please.
Yes, what I wanted to kind of throw in is that I was thinking about my position as scholar, specifically in media and communication field. So those who find it hard to fight for themselves in this professionals field, I invite warmly and cordially to join the academic community, because as a woman, I have never felt like neglected or turned down in media and communication studies, basically. So that was something that I wanted to add, that there is a different path if you want to be involved in media and communication, but yeah, maybe not as a professional anymore. So academia is very welcoming. But about this female proportion in leadership, to me it feels that actually I don't want to get very like stereotypical. I don't know whether this is something that the men adopt in some way just to survive, probably. But still, I don't think that's so much about which gender or what is the gender of the person in the leadership. I think that the values and the perspectives on how things must be done can be shared equally by all genders. So it's not that much about, so is the head of the organization a man or a woman. It's about the mindset, about the values, I think, and about this what is the idea? So why are we communicating? What is the role of communication in our organization? I think that's the main thing. So what is my perspective on this? Because we know that this what the management thinks about communication, so it influences the whole communication processes in the organization. So you will not get through, and it's this very complex relationship maybe ended this between this management and the communication department, and how do they negotiate, and how the communication department carves out its place in the organization as well. And so I don't think it's that much about the gender, because although I was smiling when Erin was saying, and it's still this situation, that the management level is strongly dominated by men, at least in Latvia, but it's more about, so what values do we stick to in our daily work? My answer, short, long,
And one other point, adding on to what you said, but also the point was made earlier about how central communication is to what the organization is. It's Erin. My perception of Erin and what I know of her and how she does her job is that, and she referred talking to the governor about things. She's not somebody that is waiting in an office down the hall to be delivered something. She's in the discussions. That is very key to having credibility in doing your job, is that it's clear that you are involved in these discussions. And Erin, like me, I mean, I'm not making decisions for Indiana University, but I'm involved in these discussions at a fairly high level. And so I can speak to them with some credibility. That's pretty easy to pick up on the outside. People do know if it, Erin has credibility because it's clear that she knows what she's talking about and that she has access to the information, and that you can't fake. And I think that that's really key. And so in any organization, you should fight to be in the middle of it so that you know what you can share and you can speak with some credibility on things. And that's just really, really important.
Thank you, John. I want to just say to the our participants in the Zoom room, please send us more questions. We have 15 minutes left. We have a few other issues to talk about, but if you have questions you want to pose to the panelists, please submit those now. In moving towards closing this conversation, I want to ask our panelists to imagine government communication in 20 years from now. What do you think? What would it look like? And take a second to imagine it, and then I'd like to hear from you. What do you think? What would that dynamic look like? Erin, you want to go first?
I'll try. I think, because I was, when I was looking at the questions and kind of preparing, the thing that always that struck me is that in my time, right? So I graduated from IU in 2001. So in my time, it has gone from, the 24-hour news to 24 seconds with social media. You had your cable news, then you have your social media, and what's next? So I don't even, like, my brain can't even wrap around how much quicker and shorter we're going to be giving snippets of information, or people are going to be taking that in. I think that we are up against a clock where you're talking about the critical thinking piece and people just getting their news from headlines. And I do think that news is going to be even more divided, journalism, where it doesn't, I don't know if these very biased publications, I don't think they're going away. So, they seem to be thriving, actually. So or bloggers like that consider themselves journalists, because anybody can be one. There'll be more avenues and platforms for that. So I'm not really answering. I'm saying I have no idea, but I think that those are the things that we're up against that are only, in my head, that are only going to get worse, unless, I guess, the education is key on how to kind of teach people how to properly inform themselves, but also how to combat misinformation in a professional and accurate manner that's really going to disperse out to all of your audiences, because we were discussing that as well. I didn't really answer your question. I just gave more problems, but.
No, that is part of answering it. I mean, we nobody knows what it, of course, what it would look like. But I mean, you must be in a position, you and Chuck specifically, where you can see it coming because you're there, right? Academics are typically a little slower to pick up on it. So that I want to take this opportunity to ask what you're seeing. Chuck, do you have some?
Yeah, I mean, it's so difficult to predict, and the changes, as Erin reflected, I mean, in 20 years have been so immense. I think that the era of partisan press is fully back, and now I say that realizing that it never was gone, and certainly in Europe and other parts of the world, it's always been around. But the difference here, at least in this country, and I think probably worldwide, is the credibility that it's given, because unlike, I mean, the New York, I'll hold up my prop, New York Times printed, in color, looks really nice. Well, you don't have to have a printing press, like Benjamin Franklin putting out something in the colonial days. You just have to have access to the internet, and the design is really easy now. So you can make things look fairly real and credible. so everybody's on sort of an equal playing field to some extent. What I hope, one of the things that we certainly don't do, and Erin doesn't do, is try to create our own partisan press. Trying to, as a government agency, as a university, that's not really our role. Our role is information. Now, if you go to the newsroom site for Indiana University, news.iu.edu, it looks like a newsroom, but it's clearly IU, and you can identify that this is not a news outlet. This is IU's outlet for stories. I fear that more places may try to combat by creating their own space in the news media. I really think, I have a very almost radical idea for American journalism. I actually think that journalists should have like their own bar association, and the standard should be very, very high, and you should have to pass the exam to become a licensed journalist by their own organization, not a government agency, but by their own organization. I don't think that'll ever happen, but I think that could go a long way towards helping create this standard that is really back to where it should be, and create the difference of the playing field that we should have. It shouldn't be where the consumer has to sift as much as they do, but I'm afraid that's here to stay. I'm afraid we're going to have to take some action worldwide to try to keep that from being something that is more of a problem than it is now. And it's a big problem right now.
Yeah, Agnesia, what about you?
Yeah, you very nicely highlighted that my task in this world is to analyze what has already happened. So I'm totally not an expert in predicting the future, but what I maybe want to emphasize and kind of outline, so what we as educators can continue and try to kind of improve our work on making the formal education in communication and media more flexible, and keep the study programs up to date, and work more with professionals from the field, so that not to keep our students in this academic bubble but really already during the studies give them sense of what the real life looks like, and what are they going to face and be challenged with when they enter the profession. So that I think that's my plan for next 20 years, basically. So yeah, improve the product. I know that many colleagues of mine will hate me for saying that education is not a product, but I consider it as something that we need to keep relevant and keep innovative, so that we help our institutions and government communicators to make the organizations and the communication more inclusive, more transparent and just, and make the world a much better place for all of us to live in. So yeah.
Thank you. I do think we're here, and we think that government communication programs and having government communicators in the field, that it's important for the well-being of democratic way of life. And I must say, I hold some concerns myself, but listening to everybody here today, I hear the concern in all your voices. So maybe we could do a last round. We have about 6 minutes left, and I don't see any new questions, but how you think government communicators can help the resilience of the democratic way of life and democratic systems. If you have any specific insights, almost a way of giving assignments for future communication or government communication workers on what they can do to help and support the resilience of democracy when they hit the job market.
Well, I can tell you this, that before I took on the role of spokesperson for IU, for years, seeing it from the other side as a journalist, and also not just with whoever was speaking for IU, but in all sorts of spokesperson roles, I often thought about, well, if I was doing that, I wouldn't have said this. I would have said it this way. And not that I have figured it all out, but I do think that the exercise of it is helpful. And I think that one of the things that I always have tried to do in this role is speak with humanity. It's really easy to get jaded and go, would these people leave me alone about the vaccine? It's really easy to do that. But there are people out there that have real concerns, and they are real people that someday that might be me calling up some other government office. I think play those scenarios out in your head. Think about how you would do it in their shoes. It's sometimes I don't know, but I do think I've thought back a lot on circumstances I've been in that are a lot like circumstances I've seen in the past, and that thinking about that from all those years ago has really, really helped me. Just to kind of know, okay, this is what happened then. This is where I think that went wrong. And this is what I would like to say, and I really can't. I think really think about how you would do it, because someday you'll find yourself in that position, and you want to kind of have run through that in your head a bit.
Chuck, it sounds like it's a profound statement for training future government communicators, is be a human being, right?
Yeah, exactly.
As simple as that in
Yep.
in the very wide meaning of that idea. Erin, something from you.
Yeah, as we were talking this last 2 hours, one thing I think that I sometimes am surprised by when I meet people where communication is not natural for them. And so how they communicate and connect with people is not, it's not intuitive. And so you're like, well, I don't understand why you didn't say that, or why you said it that way. That doesn't make sense, or why you went to that. And then I have to be like, okay, not everyone has the tools. So I think having those tools and knowing how to communicate with different people, because not everybody receives information the same way. And that goes to the audience thing as well, where know your audience, because just because you put it up in your website and you send it to your email distribution list does not mean that Mary Jo down in Southern Indiana, who this is directly going to impact, knows what's happening, because she's not online. She might not even have broadband. So know your audience and where they're at, so you can meet them there and communicate with them the way that they're going to understand and respect you. Don't speak too high level. Don't speak too in the weeds. It just depends who your audience is and who's across that table from you. I think that's very important to know.
Last comment from you, Agnesi, if you could wrap this up for us with how you
Probably again, speaking as an educator, never stop learning and improving, because we live in a world that is changing extremely quickly, and situations will come, and you can never be prepared fully for everything that you're going to face. And I think that's the key. Always keeping your eyes and ears open, trying to be ahead, and trying to be in this position of predicting what's gonna happen and how am I going to face it. So that's kind of thing I can add. But I truly support and agree with the both previous speakers about what they mentioned.
Well, thank you so much. We've lost two of our panelists, one with technical problems and another one who had to go do some work. But I really want to thank the three panelists who stayed with us for these 2 hours and offering very frank and honest and insightful comments. Yeah, I've made lists here of things that I've learned through this conversation. So I want to thank them all, and also people who listened in and provide and ask questions. And I also want to thank our colleagues again in Kiev for taking on the huge responsibility to start these programs in government communication. And finally, I want to thank Mackenzie, the technical wizard who has kept us going here for 2 hours. I can tell you it was not a small task to get me to log in and be here. I experienced all kinds of technical problems this morning. We'll continue this conversation, of course, and yes, thank you once again, and stay healthy. And yeah, I'm sure this is not the last time we've seen each other. Have a good weekend. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.